Foundation. Tonight, we come together from across the state to listen, to learn, and to be inspired in community. Our next Snapshot event will be hosted at the Kellogg Hubbard Library in Montpelier and features an evening with poet Amber McBride at 6 p.m. Please be sure to register online to receive a link to the live stream. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. Isaac Evans-Frantz is no stranger to most of us in this room. He is the director of Action Corps, which campaigns for U.S. policies to save lives globally. With Isaac's leadership, Action Corps played a pivotal role in Congress's historic passage of the Yemen War Powers Resolution in 2019. During the COVID pandemic, he brought together more than 100 organizations representing tens of millions of Americans to campaign for international relief, which, when it was released, became the largest ever transfer of such resources to the global south. Awesome, thank you. Isaac serves on the Vermont Sierra Club Executive Committee and the Advisory Board of Freedom Forward, where he has advocated for LGBTQ people globally. Neda Saleh is a Yemeni-born peace activist and graduate from UC Berkeley. She founded Hands Off Yemen, a youth-led organization raising awareness about the war and the blockade of Yemen. Neda has organized rallies nationwide, secured congressional meetings, and led national coalition efforts. As coordinator of Action Corps, she focuses on policy advocacy to end U.S. involvement in Yemen's war. She has also trained volunteers nationwide to advocate for anti-war U.S. policy. In her community, she volunteers to assist Yemeni immigrants in their transition, guides first-generation students, and addresses educational barriers with Oakland Unified School District's Arab American programs. So welcome to Brattleboro, welcome to Vermont. And here's Isaac.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for those of you who are participating here in person and those who are participating online. We're so glad to have you with us this evening. We wanted to just get a little bit of a sense of who's in the room and also who's watching online. Do you have any, would folks who are watching online be able to put in the chat where you're participating from? We'd love to get a sense of the geographic diversity with us this evening. Oh, let me pass you the mic so folks can hear. And this is Emily from the Vermont Humanities Council.
Thank you. So it looks like we have New York City, we have New Jersey, Westminster West, and Brattleboro here represented.
Great, thank you. So Neda, I'm going to pass the mic to you now. Oh, you have a mic there yourself.
All right, thank you so much for being here. I'm Neda, and I just wanted to talk to you a bit about our work for the Yemen campaign and also a bit about Action Corps and the kinds of work that we do. So on the screen, you'll see that we have a photo of some of our volunteers back in the day in front of Capitol Hill, and our mission really is to champion policies that save lives around the world. And the goal is that everyday Americans can feel like they're a part of this mission. So the world is in crisis, and Americans aren't equipped. Violence, climate emergency, inequality, and disease exist, and people are suffering. And most Americans are not equipped to change the system, but it doesn't have to be this way. This is a snapshot of some of the work we're doing. And so this is a photo of one of our former chairs connecting with her community, Sumaya Romaim, connecting with her community in the Riverdale Church. And then it's a picture of our current chair of the board meeting with a member of Congress. So we are about connecting with the communities and also connecting with our policy and legislation. So a bit about us. So we have volunteers in 30 states. And that is about 60 senators that we are hoping to reach through these volunteer teams. And we have some more information on the screen about what we're about, where we're from, who sponsors us. If you're interested in that, I'll leave it up for a second. But the idea is that we are not working with a lot, but we are getting a lot done with the 30 states that we have volunteers. So a bit about how we got involved. And I'll be telling my story about how I came to this work and why. And so on the screen is a photo of me when I was 15 years old and my cousins on the streets of Union Square, San Francisco. And so this event right here was the accumulation of a few things. So I'll start with the fact that I was born in Yemen, and I moved here when I was around 4 years old. And although I've always connected with my culture, being a Yemeni woman, it's always been a huge part of my identity, I never quite connected with the war in Yemen until I was around 15 years old, and I started hearing about how the Saudi blockade on Yemen is preventing food from getting in to the people of Yemen, and they were starving from almost completely preventable causes. And so I and my cousins, who also resonated with this, got together and we baked a whole bunch of cookies, and we got to the streets of San Francisco in one of the densely populated areas called Union Square, and we sold these cookies. And on these signs, as you can see, we're saying the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. $1 can end suffering. There is flyers that we attached to the cookies that we sold that talked about the Saudi blockade on Yemen, talked about how this was largely preventable, and the US was involved in all of this. And so after this event, I moved to Cairo, Egypt, to a city called El Faisal. And El Faisal is a neighborhood mainly populated by Yemeni and Syrian refugees. And so in my time there, I actually saw the effects of the war on my people right in front of me. I was used to seeing the news. I knew there were horrible things happening to people, but seeing people walking the streets who didn't have all their limbs, missing legs, missing eyes, missing ears, having bandages around their heads. And whenever I would visit the hospital just for a checkup, the entire room would probably be Yemenis with a couple of Egyptians. And mind you, this is in Egypt. And in the hospitals in Egypt, Yemenis were populating the hospitals in Egypt because of the crisis and the suffering of the war. And so I lived there for a couple of years with my grandma, and then I moved back to the United States in 2020, just at the start of the pandemic. And that was an even more stressful time because of all the Yemenis that were fleeing Yemen to go to Egypt. They were now they were stuck by the lockdown. And then also the vaccine requirements. Vaccines were not easily accessible because of the blockade, because of the US-supported blockade. So I was looking everywhere for a way to help. I checked Google, I checked my Instagram, my Facebook, what organizations were working towards peace in Yemen. And so I came across an organization called the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and I started volunteering as a social media organizer. I would create posts for their fundraisers, and I would help spread the word about their fundraisers. And that was good for a while, but I felt that there was something more I could be doing. I felt that charity was one thing, and I was doing the charity work, but I felt that our government was involved in this crisis in a really deep and prolonging way, and that it wasn't enough just to raise money, but that we should be doing more about the policy that our government is supporting. And so I was introduced to actually Isaac by the president of this foundation, who said, this is a way you can use your voice more effectively. And so I popped into one of their national organizing calls. Isaac and the Yemeni Relief and Reconstruction Foundation are co-leading this national coalition of organizations in DC, grassroots, media, all over, that are coming together to work on Yemen. So I popped into one of these calls, and I was so surprised by how fleshed out their strategy was, and how they were bringing voices from the media, from Washington, D.C., people who were lobbying Congress, from grassroots organizers, from people doing charity work, just like the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, and they were all working together to stop U.S. involvement in the Yemen war. And this was right under my nose the whole time, and I had no idea. So when I found out Isaac was coming to California for an Action Corps meetup, I had to be there. And so I got the invite for a Berkeley, California Park meetup, and I showed up. And I had all these questions for Isaac about what are you doing? What's your organization about? What's the strategy here? How is it impacting the people of Yemen? And he told me that currently we had a promise from Representative Ro Khanna, a congressman in California, that said he would introduce an essential policy to stopping U.S. support for the war in Yemen called the War Powers Resolution. And then he had made this promise months prior, but no action was taken. And I was infuriated by this. Yemen couldn't wait. The crisis was only worsening, and Representative Ro Khanna was not taking action on this, and Congress was not taking action on this. And they had made these promises, but they were slow-walking the whole process, and they were refusing to meet with Isaac. And so I asked if I could call up my friends and we could strategize some more. And they showed up an hour later, the same people in this photo, they showed up an hour later at that park in Berkeley, and we said, let's show up to his office tomorrow with signs. And Isaac was like, well, that's the 4th of July, maybe you want to wait. So the following Friday, I think it was July 7th, we showed up at his office with signs similar to the ones on the screen, but ones that also said, Yemen can't wait. give us a date for this introduction of this essential bill and for a meeting that we've been requesting for a very long time. And that same day that we were stomping in his office and marching and making a ruckus, he gave us the meeting. And not only that, he said, could you please keep it down a little next time? So we got the meeting, and I attended this meeting, and it was something truly empowering. From going to selling cookies on the street and charity, and all of a sudden we are meeting with Congress and we're affecting policy and we're getting commitments. And mind you, just weeks earlier I had heard about this national coalition, and now I was helping drive policy change. And so that is how we came to organize a number of protests in the Bay Area. And I had not organized prior to this, but after that Rokana meeting, I saw the value of these protests and how they get some action made, actually. So we showed up to Nancy Pelosi's office here in this photo in San Francisco, and a few other places as well. I think we had a string of protests that summer, but this was how I came to know that charity is one thing and it's a great thing, but policy and advocacy is an essential pillar to making change. So that's my story. Thank you so much. I do have some more to say, though, because I'm sure that the Yemen war can be an elusive thing, and I want to tell you more about it, and I also want to open up for questions. So before I open up to my presentation about the Yemen war, just if you have any questions now, I'd be happy to take them.
And we welcome questions from participants online as well as in the room. There will be another opportunity to ask questions as well towards the end.
Okay. Yes.
Do you ever see your family?
I see my family. I actually have 13 aunts and uncles on my dad's side, 7 aunts and uncles on my mom's side. A few are here in the US, many are back home, but we FaceTime. And actually, when I was in Egypt, I lived with my grandma and some of my other cousins, so it was cool. I have a huge family.
How do you feel that, as a woman, how you have been received doing this kind of advocacy work? It sounds like you've been all around the United States, not just in the Berkeley Bay Area.
I've organized digitally some other locations, but mainly I've been in the Bay Area. But that's a really great question. I'm actually happy that you've asked it because it goes into what happened on a major protest we did in Oakland for Barbara Lee, and her staffer showed up. But the men standing behind me who brought all the signs and who brought all of the flags and who brought all these photos and leaflets were Yemeni men, and they were lined up in a row, standing behind me, and they were holding all these flags and things, and they had supported me through the way of making this protest happen. But then after, when we finished the protest, I went out for lunch with my family to the closest Yemeni restaurant, and they happened to be there. It was the closest Yemeni restaurant, and they went and they paid our bill without us knowing, and then they go up to my dad after, and they say, your daughter is an incredible woman, and we are so grateful for her leadership. And to hear that from Yemeni men, when I had been intimidated by them and thought maybe they wouldn't support this work, and for them to say that, it was just a truly powerful moment for me. So thank you for asking that question. Yes.
Yeah, as a matter of background, since I don't know much, how strong and dominant was the contingent in Congress that supported the Saudis and what they had been doing up to that point? And what tipped the balance, if anything? Your efforts were part of it, but what else was going on that may have influenced the outcome?
I think the policy changed a lot throughout the war, and we witnessed some actual actions happening within Saudi Arabia, like the death of the journalist, the killing of the journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, and other events that were happening. And I think that really helped us with our efforts and being able to highlight that this is not just a crisis that is hurting Yemenis. This country is attacking people and their rights all over. Journalists' rights to dissent, just rights all over. That country has committed major violations. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we did face major opposition, of course, and we'll talk more about that.
So at that time, you saw sort of a shift happening in some way among some congresspeople, or not?
We were definitely able to get them around the issue of free speech if they weren't interested in dying children and starving children. So. It helped us reach a new audience. I'll say that in Congress. Yes.
We have a question online. Someone is asking if you could explain what started the war.
Yes, and actually that'll be my next slide. So if they can hold it, I will go into that. All right. Okay, I will continue here then, so we can have more background on the Yemen war. So I just want to start by saying Yemen is a beautiful place, and that really gorgeous green area is where I was born. It's called Ib. And right next to it is Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen, and I lived there for a while as well. And below it are some historical sites in Yemen. So I just want to make sure you guys can see that. All right, and now to the sad stuff. So Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, and it's home to one of the largest humanitarian crises on the planet. And since 2015, Saudi Arabia, with the support of the US, has blockaded the country, and 2/3 of the population need humanitarian aid as a result. And Yemen suffered from one of the largest cholera outbreaks, I think maybe the largest in the world, and this is incredibly preventable. And so here's a little timeline of what really happened and what started the war. So there was a civil war, it was called the Arab Spring, and a number of Arab countries participated in this overthrowing of their governments for democratic turns. And then after they overthrew the current presidency, there was a power vacuum. And then the northern tribes, which included the Houthis, came, and they were a militant group that wanted to take over power, and they were able to claim power in 2014. And as a response to this, the former government, the president in exile, called for Saudi support to remove the Houthis from power. And so that actually led to the blockade and bombing of Yemen. And I don't think that was the outcome, maybe, that we would have expected, obviously, but that is what happened. And throughout the years of 2018 to 2022 and ongoing, we are participating in anti-war efforts. But in 2022, we actually saw a ceasefire, and that was a major shift and really like a manifestation of our work and the work that was happening all over the world, actually. And so that was a ceasefire by the Saudi and the Houthis, and then peace talks were happening. They were ongoing for several months. And then afterwards, the Houthis blockaded the Red Sea in response to what was happening in Israel, and then the US started directly bombing Yemen, and our work is ongoing. So any questions? Yeah. We have someone running the mic.
So the bombing was an effort to remove the Houthis?
Correct. And some more interests that, obviously exist.
What kind of interests were those?
I would say economic and other strategic alliances that they're hoping to build. And by having access and control over Yemen, they would then be able to protect their national security, they being Saudi Arabia.
Thank you.
And there's a mic behind you on the right.
So is this by drone? Do we have actual U.S. forces right now flying planes and dropping bombs over Yemen right now?
Currently, we have U.S. bombs directly going on Yemen, ordered by President Biden.
And they are, I'm just saying, there is a military presence right now. It's not just drones. There are actual fighters there doing this.
All we officially know is that there's bombs being dropped on Yemen
Okay, so we
by
don't
missile.
know.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just curious what is known about that. Because didn't somebody recently say we don't have any U.S. military forces engaged in hostility at this very moment? I thought I heard one of the candidates saying that the other day. Isn't that what am I wrong? Did I miss that, or did they say that?
I don't know what they said, but I do know that the United States, as recently as just a few days ago, has dropped bombs on Yemen without authorization from Congress, in violation of the 1973 War Powers Resolution and in violation of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which says that Congress has the power to declare war and not the president. And bipartisan groups in both the House and the Senate of the United States Congress have written this year to the White House expressing their concerns regarding constitutional war powers, and the bombing has continued until, and as recently as just a few days ago, the U.S. bombed a school and killed children. So this is happening, and we don't see much about it in the media.
No, we don't see anything about it in the media. Vera, yes.
There's
Everyone
a
else
question
is
in the back over there.
Could you speak about your relationship and the organization's relationship to the Houthi in particular? Uh, whether you think that the blockading of the Red Sea, the attack recently on a tanker that's spreading oil, whether that's all good and should be supported, or whether the Houthi are your feeling about them is that what they're doing is helpful in leading to a ceasefire or not, and so on.
Action Corps stands in solidarity with people who are experiencing violence, violent conflict, and climate disasters around the world. And so we're campaigning for US policy change. That's our focus. And we are really focused on the US Congress and their power, and where do they have leverage, what is the United States doing around the world, and looking towards de-escalation. We believe that de-escalation and diplomacy are important in creating more diplomacy and more de-escalation. So we have strongly supported an end to the US participation, an end to the US bombing of Yemen, as well as previously U.S. participation in the Saudi war on Yemen. In terms of the violence of the Houthis, I mean that has caused. The Houthis have been an active participant in the civil war in Yemen, which has caused what was the UN called the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. So we have real concerns about the violations of human rights by the Houthis and the humanitarian crisis which the Houthis have contributed to. I hope that answers the question.
I will say real quick that one of the issues prolonging the civil war in Yemen is the fact that Yemenis are not able to communicate among themselves. And when that was witnessed, there was pushback among foreign proxies who didn't like the fact that Yemenis were having Yemeni to Yemeni peace talks. And so regardless of how someone feels about the Houthis, the US should not be involved in this war and should not be making matters worse by fueling the country that's dropping bombs on Yemen and now also actively dropping bombs on Yemen. And so our power as Americans lies in our power as constituents with our Congress people. And so we need to call for the US to stop bombing Yemen so that way Yemenis could even have an avenue to speak to one another and discuss an outcome for the civil war. So that's just what I'd like to say.
So that kind of leads into what I wanted to ask, which is, and forgive my political ignorance here, but can somebody in this room explain to me how it is possible that our administration continues to violate the acts and the president is authorizing bombs without congressional approval? And how does that happen? How does that happen? And I'm hoping that what you're going to get into, I was going to ask, like, what other pressures congressionally, can we as individuals bring to bear so that we can stop this, because this is only one country that this is happening in.
The United States, for decades, Republican and Democratic administrations have unilaterally bombed and otherwise engaged in hostilities in other countries in violation of the 1973 War Powers Resolution, and from our perspective, in violation of the US Constitution. So there's a long pattern of this. It was President Obama who brought the United States into the backing the Saudi-led coalition that was engaged in the conflict with the Houthis in Yemen. That was President Obama, and then President Trump inherited that. And then and actually expanded U.S. participation in the war. But we'll get into a little bit then what activists did, who we helped bring together, and how that actually, we actually changed U.S. policy. And the good news is that Saudi Arabia has not bombed Yemen since April 1st of 2022. The United States began bombing Yemen in January of this year. But what we want to focus on what we did specifically around the U.S.-Saudi war on Yemen, and we shouldn't leave out the United Arab Emirates either, because the UAE, or United Arab Emirates, has also played a devastating role in the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and continues to be active in Yemen militarily.
Thank you. And I have some questions in the chat here. And one of the questions is, what impact will the upcoming presidential election have on your work?
Action Corps is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse any candidate for any office. And this election will have tremendous impact on our work. And I encourage people to engage civically and to do what you can to fight voter suppression. We just trained organizers from all over the country. And one of the things that we were doing is we were training on voter suppression efforts. And actually, Deb Hall here got us connected with efforts to make sure that voters around the country, especially in states where there are voter suppression policies, where a legacy of for decades of voting restrictions specifically directed towards black people in this country. We have been doing work sending postcards to make sure that voters have the information they need to vote, and we'll continue doing what we can to ensure that people are able to vote and participate in the election. I will say that one of our concerns is policies that are already moving through Congress around making it easier to shut down groups and organizations for political reasons. And the ACLU would be a resource that you could learn more about that from. But I'm thinking maybe we can move to the next slide.
All right, so I've told my story and I've talked a lot about my country, and I'd like to pass it over to Isaac, who actually introduced me to this work and this amazing coalition. So Isaac, please tell your story.
All right. Well, my story starts actually just up the street at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, where I was born. But we're gonna, and Daniel Seekin got me over here in the second row here, got me marching when I was 5 years old with the anti-war signs. But that's actually not how I came to this work. I was living in New York City, and I was part of a group of people who are concerned about humanitarian issues around the world, and particularly global food security. We had campaigned for the the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act that passed Congress, and the bipartisan Global Food Security Act. And we were looking at, well, what next should we work on? And someone from UNICEF came and spoke to our group. And she talked about 9 major food hunger crises around the world. And all of them were horrible, and all of them needed attention. But what struck me was that the one in Yemen was affecting the most number of people, and it also was the one where the United States was most directly, actively involved in causing the hunger crisis. Because Saudi Arabia, with US backing, was bombing with US bombs, with US logistical support, like the servicing of those fighter jets, with the fueling of the fighter jets, was dropping bombs on farms, on water treatment facility plants. Remember, it was the largest cholera outbreak in recorded history. What do you need to fight cholera? You just need clean water. But if you're bombing the water treatment facility plants, that's going to make it so people can't get clean water. So when I had heard a little bit, I knew that there were NGOs that were working on this issue. I got an email from Oxfam. They were trying to stop weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. And so when I heard about this, I thought, okay, the person from UNICEF was asking us to do, to make a $3 donation could get vaccine for a child. And I thought, there's got to be something more that we could do. And so I knew there were some, let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is about the Saudi, the U.S.'s role in this war. So if you think about a crime that's being committed, there's the car, and the driver, there's the gun, the bullets. Let's keep going. You know, the map that shows, you know, the person giving directions to maybe they're going to try to rob a bank or whatever the crime is, and then the fuel. Well, the one thing that's missing from this picture is the actual person who commits the crime, or who holds the gun up in the bank, right? Well, this is an analogy for the U.S.'s role in this war on Yemen. The United States was in the command room with Saudi Arabia as they were making targeting decisions. The United States was supplying the weapons, was supplying the ammunition, was actually doing, in the middle of these flights that Saudi Arabia was doing, the United States came up, was doing mid-air refueling so that they could then go drop bombs on weddings and funerals and schools and school buses and so on and so forth. And actually, just as a side note, there was a justification, that the Houthi rebels were hiding amongst the civilians. But that school bus full of children, with over 40 school children, I don't know exactly how that was justified. But that was something we kept on hearing, like this is how we have to wage this war.
I did hear somewhere, maybe online or someone of power, say that that school bus was filled with future terrorists. So.
And what someone in the audience just said is that's the BS that we hear about Palestinians all the time. It's also very similar to what was said during the Vietnam War about by a very racist leader of the United States who was making comments about how these children, what they were going to be as adults. Very cynical and very dehumanizing. So this is what the United States' role has been. It was everything except for the person who was actually driving the plane that dropped the bombs. And our president at the time was celebrating the weapons sales. Next slide. If you go back one slide, this is Mohammed bin Salman, who's the Saudi crown prince, is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. He's a dictator. Next slide. He was coming to New York City, and this is, as he drove by, this is me shouting at him. And I shared this picture just because sometimes the organizing, it's that visceral, those moments where you have that rage that is powerful and bringing people together. And we were so clear on what we were doing, what the problem was, and just to be able to have that sense, like we were showing up every day that he was, the day before he came to New York, the day that he was in New York. And those rallies made a difference in terms of we would call up the senator's offices and we would say, there's a resolution to stop US participation in this war. And we would love to be able to announce your support for this resolution at this rally that we're having, protesting the Saudi dictator's arrival in New York. We'd really love to celebrate your leadership, but we're going to let people know if you haven't. And we're going to let the press know that you haven't taken a stance and that you're continuing to be silent in the face of the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet that our government is complicit in. And suddenly, these US senators, like the next day, co-sponsoring. I mean, multiple times this sort of thing happened where the rally was able to provide that encouragement for action by the congressional office. But it really helped having a relationship with the congressional office so that they knew we were serious. That's the next slide. So back to that meeting, I started telling the story about how that person from UNICEF came. And I was remembering, I had heard that Oxfam was working on this in Washington, D.C., was working on this, stopping the weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. And I knew there were grassroots activists. This photo was actually taken a while later here in Brattleboro. I think Bert is in there, and Daniel's in there. A couple others of you, maybe MD is in there. But the point was that grassroots activists, peace activists, were a really important group here. And years before this photo was taken, I knew that there were some peace activists who were showing up every week on Saturdays in Union Square for a vigil. It was organized by the Catholic Worker Movement. And it was in solidarity with people in Yemen. The problems here, and then I also was aware, I had gone to a Yemeni restaurant. The first time I ever heard of Yemen was in Brooklyn, there was a Yemeni restaurant. And so I knew there must be Yemeni Americans in New York City. So I went to this vigil in Union Square, and I was talking to people, and they didn't have relationships with people, Yemeni Americans, and for the most part, and they didn't also know who their members of Congress were. But they had knowledge about the crisis, about the US role, and they had passion. And the NGOs weren't connected to the grassroots activists, didn't know that people were out there in New York rallying. And then we went to talk with Yemeni American community leaders who didn't really know about people who were the white Americans who are generally older peace activists, kind of folks who had protested the Vietnam War, who were protesting this war. They didn't know about this group, or there wasn't a connection. And there was a feeling of isolation. There's a civil war back home in Yemen, which the United States is participating in with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and there was sort of this disconnect between these three groups. But they each had something critical to offer. And so we just had lunch. Like I got together with a couple people to have lunch. And from there, we had a rally. And then from there, we started having more rallies. And then we started doing video calls. And pretty soon, we had a national movement that was moving legislation through Congress and ended up succeeding a historic Yemen War Powers resolution and landing it on the president's desk, which ultimately helped stop US participation, some of the most direct participation in the war, and helped lead to Saudi Arabia stopping bombing Yemen. So we can talk about exactly how that looked. We were trying to call up the leader of, one of the leaders of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to get his attention. We didn't get a call back. We were getting the runaround when we tried to schedule a meeting. So we just showed up in front of the office. It happened to be a week before his primary election, with these signs that said, Rep. Engel, stop fueling famine in Yemen, because he was completely silent about the US role in this crisis. And then, lo and behold, we got a meeting. It was the next month for an hour with him. And he went from saying absolutely nothing about this humanitarian crisis that had been going on with the US's involvement for a couple of years by that point, to co-sponsoring the Yemen War Powers Resolution to reclaim constitutional power of Congress, and making floor speeches in support of the resolution. I mean, it was from nothing to like 0 to 10. And look how many people are there. It's not that many. I mean, I was working at a community health center. I just was like, we did this rally before I had to go to work. We knew his staff was going to be coming into work, so we'd catch them on their way in. And we worked with one of the NGOs on the language for the signs. So, you know, they couldn't be there, but they could give us their opinion about what you might want to put on the sign. So that's the sort of like one of the benefits of that coalition building. And the outside, inside strategy, outside on the streets, but then being willing to talk to the member of Congress. And the next slide. We then went on to, after we got his support, we went on to Jerry Nadler's office. He's the chairman of he was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. We then went on to Representative Lowy's office, who was the top Democrat on Appropriations Committee, and we did the same thing. And we'd show up at these offices. If you go back to the last slide for a second. This was cool too, because this sign here, we were all volunteers. We didn't have any budget for any big digital signs, but there was another organization that was doing this, and they were focused on the UN. And we said, the UN isn't the problem. The problem is the United States. And the power lies with Congress, and they're abdicating their responsibility. There was a question about how is this going on? Well, Congress has been abdicating its responsibility. It's very difficult for a member of Congress. It takes political courage to introduce a resolution that's privileged, meaning it has a beeline to the floor, and it's going to force, if it can force a debate and a vote on US participation in a war, going up against the administration takes guts. And we don't see it, we haven't seen any member of Congress do that in the last several months since January of 2024, but it was done in the past. Senator Sanders led a resolution, other senators have supported, and representatives got on board when we made it difficult for them to look away. We sent this picture to this office, and like within a couple days they co-sponsored the bill. And what happened was that words traveled up to the Bronx that we were coming, and the office, before we were coming like 2 days later, and before we even got there, they co-sponsored, so we turned into a press conference thanking their office for their leadership. And it worked. And so we had enough support on this bill that, the next slide. This is Representative Pelosi's office. She was leading her caucus. She was at that point, I think she was the minority leader. We showed up in front of her office, and we had heard that this was not a priority. This wasn't even on the top 5 foreign policy priorities for her office. And she had done virtually nothing for the years that this war had been going on. We got there and we did this rally, and it was just before Thanksgiving. I was out there visiting my husband Derek's family with him, and he actually was there and his mom was there, and we organized this with the Yemeni Alliance Committee, with Yemeni Americans. And we had the sign saying, "Stop famine while Congress feasts," because it was Thanksgiving. I thought this could be still relevant messaging for this coming Thanksgiving. But what happened was I got a text message within an hour of that rally from a friend who works in Washington, D.C., saying, "Pelosi is in." And so that was an incredible moment. I have chills in my body just remembering that moment, because can you imagine, like, after years and of working on this, and the frustration, and and then suddenly you have this moment where the most important member of the Congress in terms of moving this forward supports this, and then it was much easier to move this forward. And in the next slide, you'll see what happened next. In December, the US Senate passed the Yemen War Powers Resolution with Republican and Democratic support, and led by Senator Sanders and his colleagues. That was the first time in history that Congress had ever passed a war powers resolution like this that directs the president to remove US participation in hostilities in a country, where the president hadn't already agreed to do that. Like before, it had been done symbolically, or there had been threats of it, or there may have been votes, but the fact that it was passed was incredible. And just before it was passed, the administration announced that they were going to end mid-air refueling because it wasn't needed anymore. But it was clear that just the prospect of this vote changed US policy. And then what happened was that like the day before, or a couple days before this vote, there was a Stockholm Agreement where Saudi Arabia and the Houthis agreed to not bombing the key Yemeni port city of Hodeidah, which if that city had been bombed, and it actually was bombed by in the last several months, but that's looking back at this time period, that bombing saved avoiding that bombing saved lives, because Yemen is a country that depends on imports, and so when you bomb a key port city, that would mean that people would not have the basics that they need to survive. So it was really important that we kept that port city did not get bombed. And there was also
You may want to add that 80% of Yemen relies on that specific port.
So just even before the vote happened, there was changes in US and Saudi policies. The United Arab Emirates had a drawdown of support of troops from northern Yemen. So the point that and then the House and Senate passed it again the following spring. The president vetoed that bill, but it helped just the fact that the vote was happening sent a really strong message, and the overwhelming support from both bodies of Congress sent a really important message to Saudi Arabia, and it raised the price of that war so that it was not just the cost, the economic cost, but it was also the PR cost of that war. And organizers, activists from around the country helped make that cost of the war and put a price for Saudi Arabia to continue waging it. Okay, so we're gonna watch a little video. Oh, in January 2021, it was Biden's first Monday in office. We said, okay, the Yemen War Powers Resolution is passed, but Saudi Arabia was still bombing Yemen, and the US was still participating, and there's still a blockade. And so we said, okay, let's organize people. If our governments can be in cahoots, the US, the UK, and France were all supplying weapons and military support to Saudi Arabia, we thought, well, the people from these countries, everyday people, can also organize. So here from Brattleboro, this was the pandemic, and I was home out on Bonneville Road, and just kind of thought, well, let's do something here. I reached out to Stop the War UK and the Yemeni Alliance Committee and the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. We got some groups together, and we got a day of action, Global Day of Action, World Says No to War on Yemen. And we have a short video clip about that day.
The UN quite rightly says it's the largest humanitarian disaster anywhere in the world. Just think about that for a moment. The largest humanitarian disaster anywhere in the world.
We will speak the truth about them and recognize that a Yemen baby has exactly the same value as a baby in Ethiopia, a baby in Guatemala, a baby in the American Empire, a baby in Greece, a baby in Tel Aviv, a baby in West Bank and Gaza, a baby in China. That is the spiritual and moral force behind our voices coming together.
As a Yemeni Canadian, I call on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to end the $15 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia. The arms manufactured in my hometown of London, Ontario, are used to oppress civilians in Yemen. President Biden, you unjustly entered this war back in 2015. It's now your responsibility to end all forms of support for this war and to remove all barriers to humanitarian assistance, including lifting the blockade on Yemen.
And we should end our support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen.
So any questions or thoughts about that video? What did Biden do?
Biden canceled a couple of weapons sales that were scheduled, had been approved by the Trump administration for Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration also reversed a terrorist designation against the Houthi rebels, which would have, it hadn't quite gone into effect, but Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration had put this on there, even though the humanitarian organizations say this would have been horrific because it really would have interfered with humanitarian assistance and with commercial activity. It would have been really devastating for everyday Yemenis without achieving any goals. So he reversed that. Biden also set a policy of no, and this was no offensive weapons for Saudi Arabia. We tended to see that all weapons for Saudi Arabia were offensive. And what's offensive and what's defensive is, there's debate over that. But there was a distinction, and there was some restrictions on what weapons went to Saudi Arabia. What we saw is by 2022, by 2022, the summer of 2022, he was doing the fist bump with MBS. I called the fist bump that was heard around the world. And so there was an attempt to get more economically advantageous oil policies for the United States, lower gas prices. So this was something that, so there's been there's a mixture. And recently there's been a real backsliding due to various geopolitical concerns. But the thing that's really clear is that the US prioritizes, overall, the US prioritizes its alliances over really anything else. I mean, I would say number one priority is alliances with other countries. Number two is commercial interests. And then number three is what we might call values, such as democracy or human rights or things that everyday Americans might care about. It's probably further down the list, but those first two are pretty big. But that number one, that the alliances, the geopolitical, the power and control, that's a driving force of U.S. foreign policy from what we have observed with this situation and in other examples.
Well, with our remaining 2 minutes, we just wanted to talk about the hope and power of the grassroots movement, and we'll conclude there. So, Isaac, do you want to talk a bit about our experiences maybe over this weekend with activists around the country?
Sure, and also happy to stay and answer questions and have a little back and forth. This past weekend, first of all, this is Burlington, Vermont, a couple of years ago, and we actually were effective and Senator Sanders reintroduced his Yemen War Powers resolution in 2022. We've been pleased to see the impact of organizers when we're strategic. And we just trained a bunch of organizers in Washington, D.C. this past weekend. But one thing is just a couple of weeks ago, some Action Corps members, Steve Wong was there in the back. You want to raise your hand so people know who I'm talking about? And he's involved with some other groups as well, and Kate Casa, who had gotten some information that we had shared. They asked questions of Senator Sanders, and Senator Sanders at that the lunch at the Senior Center made a commitment to introduce legislation against weapons sales to the Middle East, and that was an example of right here, just down the street, just the other day, something that ended up making national news. And today he released a press release saying that he's going to file this resolution next week. So sometimes it's about sharing some information, supporting each other, and then lifting our voices, even if it feels a little uncomfortable at times.
You don't know who can help you. Like when Isaac told me that Representative Ro Khanna was slow walking the whole process of that meeting, I was able to express my rage to my cousins, and they of course were equally enraged, and we were able to take action, get that meeting, and follow through on that promise. So you don't know who can help you. Don't be afraid to reach out.
So that concludes our prepared remarks. These are the organizers we just trained, including Karen next to MD, who lives in Westminster West, Karen Blanchard, and we also, MD is another, do you want to raise your hand, our other Action Corps Vermont organizer, and we have Ellen Schwartz, who I think is participating from home here in Brattleboro, who's our ambassador, and then we have a bunch of Action Corps members. We welcome folks to join us in campaigning for U.S. policies to save lives around the world, and we're really grateful for. We should thank the folks. We have a slide thanking folks.
We do. I just wanted to share this photo. This is the men in the background that I was talking about, who I ran into at the Yemeni restaurant. Yeah. Oh yeah. All right. Oh yeah, I was yelling to the microphone.
Do folks have any questions or things that struck them that you were moved by, or that made you any new information you learned? I used to be a middle school teacher, so the U.S. is directly bombing Yemen. You didn't know that? Yeah. Yeah. What's up with that? It's a great question. Any folks who are watching on YouTube? Okay. Well, we welcome any questions or feedback in the room. Nick.
Yeah, you mentioned that Bernie Sanders said he was going to introduce a resolution against funding wars in the Middle East. I think that's how you put it. Does that mean against funding Israel?
The administration announced the $20 billion weapons sale that to Israel this summer, and in July, and the joint resolution of disapproval that Bernie has announced today that he's introducing next week is about that weapons sale.
How does that look in terms of support?
They'll have 6 senators.
I'm trying to limit my comments to talking about the history of what we had done. However, I will say that one of the things we found in the work that we did was that even when we don't win a vote, it's often important to have it. So there were many failed votes, failed in quotation marks, because we didn't get majority in the House and Senate prior to the ones that we won. The first one was that I remember hearing about was a vote on cluster munitions for Saudi Arabia, which are indiscriminate weapons and really horrendous to civilians. And there was a vote on it, and there were, I don't know, a couple dozen representatives or something who supported this ban on cluster munitions for Saudi Arabia. This is a fraction of the members of the House of Representatives. But it was important in making a stand. The representatives had to take a position on it by having a vote on it. It was a public vote. Their names, there was a roll call, that we know how they voted. And then you see who supported you, and then you build on that. And that's what the coalition did build on. They saw, okay, so then the idea is the next vote you have, it might not be about cluster munitions, it might be whatever it is, but somehow related, you get more. So the point is that, it's about building, and sometimes our victories are incremental, but they help lead to bigger victories and policy changes over the long run.
And many members of Congress have changed their positions on the current war we're seeing in Israel from the start till now in drastic ways. And that probably wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for the small bills and resolutions being introduced along the way.
Great questions. Any final questions? All right. Well, we want to thank the Vermont Humanities Council and Brooks Memorial Library for sponsoring this event and for hosting us. Really appreciate all of the attention to detail and all of the Brattleboro Community Television for live streaming this event. Thank you to Wyndham World Affairs Council for spreading the word about the event, and thank you to all of you for being here online and here in person.
And the interpreter. Shout out to the interpreter.
Yes, thank you. And for folks here in the room, if you would like to join us down the street at midnights, we're going to head over there. We'd love to hang out with you for a little while. And just a note of cultural sensitivity, you may have guessed Neda is Muslim. And it's fine. Women, you want to give Neda a handshake, that's great. But it's generally courteous for men not to extend your hand, as generally physical contact between men and women who aren't in the same family is generally frowned upon. So that's just something you can do to help Neda feel comfortable in our community. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And please come back next Wednesday to have a chat with Meg Mott about what the First Amendment asks of us.